There are very few faces in the world of comics more instantly recognisable than Jack Kirby. Both in terms of the man himself and his iconic artwork, Kirby's legacy is felt throughout every corner of modern pop culture, breathing life into countless superheroes and pioneering many new approaches to visual storytelling. Particularly in the world of Marvel, where he created many of the universe's most beloved characters, Kirby's impact stretches to every niche corner of the universe. However, his legacy extends far beyond the likes of the X-Men, the Fantastic Four and the Avengers, with Kirby also spending an extended period of time working for many other comic book companies, including Marvel's biggest rival, DC. Kirby's shocking switch to DC Comics in 1970 is a fabled and storied piece of comics history. For readers who had fallen in love with Kirby's larger-than-life depictions of Marvel's characters, the chance to see him draw the likes of Superman, Batman and Wonder Woman seemed irresistible. However, for a multitude of reasons, this isn't how things would turn out. You see, while Kirby did move to DC and begin telling Superman stories in the pages of Superman's pal Jimmy Olsen, something seemed strangely off about his depiction of the Man of Tomorrow, as readers would soon discover that Jack's pencils were being erased and changed, with DC hiring other artists to redraw Superman's face in many of Kirby's comics. This controversy is not only shocking, but it's also emblematic of Kirby's troubled time at DC in the early 1970s, and the struggles he faced when attempting to bring his unique creative vision to life. So in this video, I want to explain the history of Jack Kirby's time at DC, discuss how the writer sought to use the Jimmy Olsen comic to pioneer a new generation of superhero storytelling, and ultimately try and uncover just what went wrong, and why DC Comics attempted to erase the face of Jack Kirby's Superman. Before we continue though, just a quick reminder to leave a like on this video if you enjoy it, and subscribe to Owen Likes Comics so you don't miss out on any future videos. By the time he made the jump to DC Comics in 1970, Jack Kirby had already crafted a legacy as one of the all-time great comic book artists. Beginning in the early 1940s, when he and writer Joe Simon created Captain America for Marvel, then known as Timely Comics, Kirby became a trailblazer within the comic book industry, working not only for Timely, but many other companies as well. Following his return from the Second World War, and after a pay dispute with Timely's owner Martin Goodman, Kirby would spend much of the 1950s working as a freelancer, creating the likes of Fighting American and the Challengers of the Unknown during this period. He would begin working primarily at Marvel again in 1958, and it was here where Kirby's career would truly begin to be elevated to the next level, as he entered a long-running partnership with the company's main writer and editor, Stan Lee. This collaboration would not only revitalise Marvel Comics' fortunes, but rocket the entire company into superstardom. Together, the duo created much of what we today consider to be the modern Marvel universe throughout the early to mid 1960s. However, whilst Marvel Comics was riding high, by the end of the decade all would not be well internally, as Kirby began to feel disillusioned over the amount of credit and recognition he was receiving for his contributions. These feelings were amplified in 1968, when after Kirby had single-handedly created the Silver Surfer character 2 years prior, Stan Lee would greenlight a standalone comic for the character, tasking artist John Buscema to draw the series. Feeling slighted that he wasn't invited to work on the title of a character he solely created, Kirby soon after began exploring his options, eventually meeting with DC editorial director Carmine Infantino and deciding to make the switch to Marvel's distinguished competition. Upon signing an initial 3-year contract with DC in late 1970, Kirby immediately set the terms for how he would work, seeking to avoid the same problems that he ran into at Marvel. In particular, he insisted that he either work with a writer who would provide a full script in advance, or be allowed the opportunity to write his stories himself. DC would agree to this, and the question soon shifted to what books Kirby would take over. With DC Comics hyping the artist's arrival as their biggest ever acquisition, many were eager to find out where the King of Comics would next ply his trade. According to Kirby, Infantino suggested that he take over the Superman title, as the comic had been slumping in sales for several years up until this point. However, he refused, not wanting to take take the job away from the book's existing creative team. Now, while Infantino has disputed this claim, arguing that he was hesitant to give Kirby Superman out of the gate, the duo eventually decided to search for a book without an ongoing creative team. In addition to 3 new comics that Kirby would write and draw himself, Mr. Miracle, Forever People, and The New Gods, the creator was also given the rather unexpected task of creating new stories for Superman's pal Jimmy Olsen. While Olsen had been a regular Superman character since 1941, and his solo title had ran since October 1954, I think few honestly expected this to be the landing pad for Jack Kirby in DC Comics. But to best understand why this was such a strange choice, I want to hand the video over to Scott Nicewander, who will explain the origin of the Jimmy Olsen comic series, the state of the title prior to Kirby's arrival, and a little bit on how the creator aimed to revolutionise the DC universe for the most unlikely of places.
Okay, so Owen titled this section of the video The Real Origin of Jimmy Olsen, and I don't think he understood what a massive can of worms he just opened. Okay, so the first official comic book appearance of Jimmy Olsen was in Superman number 13 from 1941. However, you will notice that I put in quite a few qualifiers into that sentiment. Why did I have to specify that it was the first official comic book appearance of Jimmy Olsen? Well, it's because the character actually debuted about a year and a half earlier on the Adventures of Superman radio program as sort of a occasionally reoccurring character played by Jack Larson. However, even though that is when the character was first officially named, Jimmy Olsen has been retconned into comic books that came out before the radio show. And that's why the other qualifier I used earlier is that Superman number 13 was the first official appearance of Jimmy Olsen in comics. An unnamed office boy at the newspaper that Clark and Lois worked at made several appearances between 1938 and 1941. Decades later, it was retroactively decided to make this unnamed kid the now much more well-known Jimmy Olsen, which means technically, Jimmy Olsen's first comic book appearance was in Action Comics number 6, even if that's not what was intended at the time. But I mean, what a fantastic introduction. I mean, look at my boy, right? This chipper little redhead photographer out getting a scoop, about to be smacked in the head by a big gorilla. Considering the many, many interactions that Jimmy Olsen would have with gorillas in his own comic book series, this seems incredibly fitting. Because you see, it's through Jimmy Olsen that DC realized they had a really interesting avenue to explore their universe and their biggest, most popular superhero. Superman already had multiple ongoing series, but if fans can't get enough of them, then why not launch a brand new series? One with a perspective that his younger fans might find even more captivating. A comic book centered around a young character in the DC universe, who's not just a fan of Superman, but his close personal friend. In 1954, Superman's pal Jimmy Olsen debuted. Jimmy was no longer just an office boy. He was a cub reporter, always on the hunt for scoops that were way too big for him to find himself in the middle of. Because the stories in this series are completely bonkers, but in the best way. Just about every issue is a series of short, self-contained slapstick adventures that Jimmy and Superman go on. And I think you can really tell just how much fun the many writers and artists who worked on this book were having with it. They were just doing all sorts of creative things. They explored every color of kryptonite. Jimmy got a whole bunch of superpowers. I mean, literally any story that they could think of was thrown into Superman's pal Jimmy Olsen. I mean, this was the silver age of comics. Nothing was off the table. I mean, technically, lots of stuff were off the table thanks to the Comics Code Authority, but it's not like Jimmy Olsen needed to be overly violent or anything. And I don't know how true this is, but I have seen sources that say the reason these stories were so bonkers is because the cover artist would draw up something totally bananas, and the writers and artists of the story would have to take that cover and turn it into a fully fleshed out tale. Honestly, I love that. It would be like if I made this thumbnail for Owen and he now had to make a video about it. Tell him to make a video about it. Get in the comments, make him do it. And looked, clearly this formula worked. At the time, in the 60s, Jimmy Olsen was one of the highest selling comic books, selling about 500,000 copies each month. This is all important context, because there's a myth floating around that says when Jack Kirby left Marvel to go work at DC Comics, he approached them and said, "Give me your worst-selling comic book and I'll turn it around." And that's how he ended up with Jimmy Olsen, according to this myth that's obviously wrong. Because, as I've explained, Jimmy Olsen comics were doing numbers. It was far from the worst-selling comic book that DC had. According to Kirby, King of Comics, what actually happened is that Jack Kirby was invited to take any current comic and run with it, doing whatever he wants, which on one hand is really exciting, right? The freedom to take literally any character and do whatever, but that would involve kicking off the current creative team, the writers and the artists that were already on the book, and that's not really what Jack Kirby wanted to do. He didn't want to replace one creative voice with his own. So instead, he asked to be assigned any comic book that didn't already have a creative team assigned to it. And as I said earlier, Jimmy Olsen comics were constantly having different writers and artists pop in and out. No one was really firmly attached to the book. So Jimmy Olsen became the perfect candidate to hand over to Jack Kirby. He took it over starting in issue 133, and he turned it around, like totally, completely turned it around from a goofy issue-to-issue little romp to instead tell this spiraling cosmic tale of intergalactic conflict. But I feel like I've been talking too much. Owen, please stop me.
Although Superman's pal Jimmy Olsen had become an established title by the time that Jack Kirby made the jump to DC, it's clear that few could have anticipated that this would be his first book at the company. Kirby had left Marvel working on household names like the Fantastic Four, Captain America and Thor, and now found himself writing a book best known for its slapstick comedy and wild over-the-top covers. However, whilst it was a somewhat underwhelming first step in this new phase of his career, Kirby would actually write and draw the title for close to 2 years, using it as a vehicle to introduce countless new characters, worlds and concepts into the DC universe. Despite being a more obscure title, Jimmy Olsen would give the creator the opportunity to frequently use the Man of Tomorrow in their stories, with Kirby seeking to use Superman as a way to introduce his new ambitious intergalactic saga, The Fourth World. Although Kirby's main focus when moving to DC was to tell this new and original story, the idea was to integrate it into the established DC universe by bringing key characters from the likes of the New Gods into conflict with Superman and his best pal. As such, in Jimmy Olsen issue 134, Kirby's second issue writing the title, he would introduce the main antagonist of his Fourth World series, in the form of Darkseid. However, this attempt to create synergy between all of Kirby's ongoing comics would lead to the creator coming into conflict with DC editorial, who began to express concerns over his portrayal of Superman. In particular, DC higher-ups feared that Kirby's art style, which had become so synonymous and identifiable with Marvel, wouldn't fit with the well-established look of Superman that had been crafted by artists like Kurt Swan. As Reed Tucker would explain in his book Slugfest,
Kirby soon ran into trouble with his depiction of Superman. The character was a lucrative license for DC, appearing on lunchboxes and t-shirts, and the publisher insisted that the character always appear on model in the comics. Deviation or experimentation was not tolerated, but Kirby drew the Man of Steel in his own distinctive Kirby style, a bit less handsome, a bit more angular.
Believing that Kirby's depiction of the hero would stray too far from the classical stylings of the character, DC would task other in-house artists to touch up and redraw elements of Kirby's pencils. Perhaps the most frustrating part of this is that Kirby was never actually given the chance to prove the company otherwise, as in the pages of the very first comic that Kirby worked on at DC, Superman's pal Jimmy Olsen issue 133, the hero's face would be redrawn by Al Plastino, a longtime DC artist who had frequently drawn Superman throughout the 1950s. Not only would Plastino also retool Superman's face in the debut issue of Forever People, but this trend would continue in future issues of Jimmy Olsen, with DC tasking the book's regular inkers, Vince Colletta and Murphy Anderson, to bring Kirby's sketches more in line with how the titular hero had traditionally been drawn. Kirby would soon be informed of what was going on by his assistants, Mark Evanier and Steve Sherman, and as one might imagine, he was far from pleased with what DC were doing to his artwork. Jack. Writing on his blog in 2003, Evanier recalls how
Jack hated that they were doing this, though he was such a good sport about it that he apparently convinced some at the office that he thought he was fine with it. But he thought it was insulting, and he also thought that it was just bad business. If you're selling the fans a Superman by Kirby, you ought to give them a Superman by Kirby. Moreover, he was never that wild about drawing other folks' characters anyway, and he felt that if DC didn't want to publish a Kirby Superman, they shouldn't have him on a comic that featured Superman. He also thought it was odd that they were constantly talking about modernizing Superman and bringing him into the 70s, but confronted with a new approach, they immediately called in a guy who'd been drawing Superman since 1948. Plastino wasn't even being given work on the Superman comics at the time because his style was regarded as old-fashioned.
While Kirby was admittedly unhappy with the changes, he decided not to vocalise these concerns with DC editorial, seeking to avoid the same tensions that caused his departure from Marvel. Despite this, a compromise was seemingly made soon after, when Mike Royer, who was the main inker on Kirby's Fourth World books, took over working on Jimmy Olsen, beginning with issue 146. As a frequent collaborator of Kirby's, Royer sought to maintain the style and feel of his iconic artwork, while still making the changes that DC had mandated. Unfortunately though, Royer would only ink 3 issues of the Jimmy Olsen comic, as Kirby would end his run in April of 1972 following the release of issue 148. By this point in time, Jack Kirby's reputation within DC Comics was beginning to change, as the luster of his highly publicised arrival had now worn off, and many within the company felt underwhelmed by his offerings. As such, both the New Gods and Forever People were cancelled later that year, with editorials citing poor sales and a mixed critical response to Kirby's often wordy and abstract style of storytelling. Kirby, meanwhile, blamed DC for these sentiments, feeling that the company's editorial mandates and forced changes to both his artwork and storyline plans had constantly prevented him from truly executing his epic vision. And it's hard to argue against Kirby's claim when you realise the extent to which his artistic freedom was curtailed. Not only were his initial plans for the Fourth World extended, with the artist originally only imagining it as a limited series, but when telling the types of stories that DC were asking for, the company would frequently change his artwork behind his back, directly or indirectly sabotaging the same unique creativity they desperately sought when hiring him, with this problem best encapsulated by the strange and ill-fitting face forced onto Jack Kirby's Superman. 1972 would prove to be a turbulent year for Jack Kirby, as not only did he conclude his run on Superman's pal Jimmy Olsen and see the cancellation of 2/3 of his ambitious Fourth World saga, but his perception within DC Comics began to change. Only 2 years earlier, DC were heralding Kirby's arrival as the biggest acquisition in company history, plastering adverts teasing his switch from Marvel into the pages of almost all of their comics. Flash forward to the then present day, and Kirby's entire legacy and reputation were being questioned by his colleagues and superiors, with many within the company believing that his time at DC had been a failure. The extent to which this is true is disputable. However, it would later come to light that some senior figures within DC Comics were actually hoping for Kirby to underperform in order to demonstrate their superiority over Marvel. Mark Evanier would later note how one of these figures was Sol Harrison, then DC's production manager. Evanier states that,
"When I first met Harrison in 1970, almost the first thing he said was, 'Can you tell Jack to stop drawing square fingers? He should draw more like Kurt Swan.' But I thought to myself, who do you think you just got? You guys just landed the top artist in the business, and you want him to draw like everything you've been publishing for 20 years?
Harrison was not the only senior figure hoping for Kirby's downfall, as Evanier also recalls a conversation with editor Mike Sikowski, who was allegedly told by Carmine Infantino that DC's insistence on having other artists redraw Kirby's work was primarily a way to score a victory over Marvel. Regardless of your feelings of Kirby's work on the likes of Jimmy Olsen, Mr. Miracle, and the New Gods, I think it's fair to say that the creator wasn't given the free rein that he was promised, and quickly found himself in the crossfires of a war between two publishers. Kirby would eventually leave DC in 1975. However, the story of Jack Kirby's Superman doesn't actually end here, as Kirby would actually get the opportunity to tell another Superman story almost a decade later. You see, in 1984, Kenner Toys acquired the license to make action figures based off DC's catalogue of heroes, superheroes. To help publicise this new line of toys, the two companies collaborated on a tie-in comic book, with Kirby being hired to oversee and help write the story. This book, entitled Superpowers, would prove to be a success, and as such, a follow-up series was released the following year, with Paul Kupperberg now writing and Kirby this time working as the artist. Not only did this book, released alongside Kenner's second run of toys, allow Kirby to revisit original creations like Darkseid, but it was also the moment where he was finally able to bring his interpretation of Superman to life. By the mid-1980s, DC editorial's fears of Superman straying too far from his traditional depictions had begun to soften. As such, Kirby was now able to draw Superman in his own distinctive art style in the second volume of Superpowers, with little resistance from those above him. While the book's story, which focused around Superman and the Justice League teaming up to stop Darkseid from planting Omega seeds in the Earth's core, was largely simplistic and lacked the more nuanced and three-dimensional characterizations that had become commonplace by the 1980s, it did admittedly feel like a throwback to an era where Jack Kirby was the undisputed king of comics, which makes the fact that it was here that the artist was finally able to draw his Superman without any interference even more fitting and appropriate. Although on its own a somewhat unremarkable and forgettable title, 1985's Superpowers holds a special place in the heart of any diehard Kirby fan for what it represents in the storied history of one of comics' all-time greats. It's without question that Jack Kirby had an undeniably successful career in comics. His legacy and impact remains a cornerstone of superhero storytelling still today. However, at a time when many saw his tenure at DC as underwhelming, and his run there epitomised by the bastardised depiction of his Man of Tomorrow, getting to see the artist finally bring DC's flagship superhero to life in a truly undeniably Kirby way feels like the ultimate victory. Despite the years of adversity and roadblocks, Jack Kirby finally overcame the odds, and at the twilight of both his career and his life, received both his redemption and his justice, showcased atop the broad and iconic blue and red shoulders of Superman. Hey everyone, thank you so much for watching today's video. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please make sure to leave a like on the video and leave a comment down below as well. Let me know your thoughts on everything we talked about in today's video. I can't wait to hear what you have to say as always. If you're new to Owen Likes Comics, please make sure to hit the subscribe button and the notify bell so you don't miss out on any future videos. And if you enjoyed this and you want some more, there should be some other videos on screen right now that you might also enjoy. I want to give a big special thanks to Scott Nicewander from NerdSync for helping out and collaborating with me on this video. Scott is amazing, and I will leave links to his channels and his socials in the description, so do go check him out and keep up to date with everything he's working on. If you'd like to help support this channel though and help me make more videos, you can do so over at patreon.com/OwenLikesComics. Or if you just want some more of me, you can follow me on Twitter just at OwenLikesComics. That's all for this video though. Again, thank you all so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed it, and hopefully I'll see you next time. But until then, take care and keep reading.